Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to look at one of my 4 Tolumnias. This particular variety is called the Red Sun, and I think it has to do with the fact that it's in red when it flowers. I have 4 Tolumnias total, and this is one of the ones that are currently blooming. I have other ones that are spiking and the buds are growing, so I'm pretty sure in a couple weeks we will be able to see that one in bloom for us. I did not buy all my Tolumnias together. I bought 2 Tolumnias to start because I had never had this kind of orchid before and I wanted to give Tolumnia a try, so I purchased 2. At the time I didn't really quite know how to take care of it, so they were pretty set back because those 2 actually haven't flowered for me under my care, and one of them was actually very set back that it is now just growing some new growth. And the new growth of the other orchid from earlier is now much bigger, and I think that in the near future that one will produce flower spike and bloom for us. But back to this one, the 3rd and 4th that I have. This is one of the 2 that are spiking and blooming for us. The other one, I think it will bloom in a couple weeks, like I said earlier. So I am pretty excited, to be honest with you. Tolumnias are pretty cute. When I first came across Tolumnia orchids, I actually didn't think that they were orchids because their leaves are so fat, so plump, that they reminded me of succulent plants. I'm not sure if I talked about this before, but Tolumnia in Asia, they actually categorize it under Oncidium. So they actually called this like a mini Oncidium. They gave it another name because the leaves are usually pretty sharp, looking like a knife or sword. So they actually gave it a name of sword leaf Oncidium. So it's kind of interesting that they named this type of orchid after the shape of the leaf, looking like a sword or a knife. But all in all, I really think that this is a cute looking type of orchid because they just always reminds me of succulent plants. Now let's talk a little bit about the culture and care that I provide to this orchid. This orchid is potted in a medium mix of hydrocorn and manto clay. So essentially it's a mixture of bigger and slightly smaller pebbles together, and they are in a plastic cup with 3 drainage holes at the bottom. And I use the inner cup, outer cup method to allow additional water at the bottom of the cup. So essentially it's a hybrid between semi-hydro setup as well as traditional setup. If I leave some slight amount of water at the bottom that could get into the inner cup through the drainage hole, then that's a semi-hydro setup. But then if I decide that I don't want to have any water at the bottom of the container, then it's a traditional setup, except that this traditional setup is using an inorganic media that don't break down over time. And I really like this hybrid approach because it allows me to go between 2 method depending on weather, temperature, humidity, or how this orchid is doing to make adjustment and provide more or less moisture or water within the container. Another thing about this orchid is that the roots doesn't necessarily like to be dried out completely, but it depends on whether you have roots that have grown into the bottom of the cup that is much more moist most of the time. For example, if they are roots that are already adjusted to being in water for most of the time, then it doesn't really need to be dried out all that often. And I pretty much keep this orchid in the semi-hydro setup method. Occasionally, I let it dry out completely and then I give water, but usually the dry out period is no more than 2 days or so. So most of the time it's pretty moist, and sometimes it just has water at the bottom, so it's like a mini reservoir, and many roots have already grown into that reservoir area that this orchid is totally fine with having a little bit of wet feet. Tolumnia's roots are pretty thin, just like Oncidium orchid roots, so they really like moisture, because when they dry out they get crispy, and I really don't know how many days that they are too dry, then they die. So I tend to want to keep the roots more moist than dry, because they're so thin. There isn't a lot of moisture within the roots to last for too many days without getting watered. But one thing I know about Tolumnia roots is that they also appreciate ventilation or airflow. So that's why I mix the media with bigger pellets, bigger hydroton bowls or hydrocorn, because that way it allows the media to have slightly more air in the container to allow the roots to have a little bit of ventilation, because in their natural habitat they also grow on trees, and most of the time they grow on like the very tip end of the tree branches, for example. So they really enjoy that airflow, that air ventilation. But because the roots are so thin, so skinny, they really also need to have high humidity or high moisture around the roots to avoid drying out, avoid dying. And for the orchid fertilizer I give to my Tolumnias, it's quarter strength, 25% of the recommended strength, and I usually give fertilizer every single watering for this type of orchid. And I do also supplement with CalMag, so calcium and magnesium, and so far this orchid has been growing pretty well. The newest growth, the newest fan is the largest, so I'm really happy about that. And this time, this blooming actually has 9 bloom total, and this is the highest bloom count on a single flower spike for me, for any of my Tolumnia. So I'm pretty pleased with this flowering. Tolumnia orchids are usually pretty inexpensive. They're usually between, at least in America, I've seen them go between 10, 12 to maybe $15 per plant. It's pretty inexpensive, but obviously it's still slightly more expensive than the mini orchids that you get at grocery stores. But this kind of orchid, I never seen Tolumnias being sold at grocery stores, so you have to go online to order these from online nurseries. But in Asia, though, this type of orchid is very, very, very inexpensive. I've seen Tolumnias being sold for about $3 to maybe $5 or $7 tops. So it's much more inexpensive over there. So I think orchid hobbyists in Asia are very lucky. Overall, I really think Tolumnia orchids are cute and they're not that hard to take care of. So if you're new to this orchid hobby, I totally recommend that you get 1 or 2 just to see how well you do with this type of orchid. And even if they don't bloom right away, their leaves are cute to look at. They're like succulent plants. So I think you can never lose with this kind of orchids. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!